Good evening and welcome to the National Institute for Newman Studies 2022 Spring Symposium, The Earthly Light of Friendship, Newman's Circle, Influence, and Integrity. Over the course of our keynote lecture this evening and through several presentations tomorrow morning, we hope to shed further light on Newman and the relationships that were part of his incredible journey. It has been nearly 6 months since our last major gathering, our fall conference on Newman as scholar, sage, saint, which, as a large international conference featuring 54 presentations, was a departure from the normal size of our events. This spring, we returned to the norm, and we decided to feature presentations outside of our keynote lecture by NINS and Duquesne-affiliated scholars. On behalf of the Institute, I want to thank our Board of Trustees for the ongoing support of our mission and work. I also want to thank those of you who are joining us, whether in person or remotely. In contemplating this event many months ago, we thought of the broader context and the many difficulties being faced by so many. The fear and uncertainty surrounding the pandemic and the tragic toll it has taken were especially fresh in our minds. Friends and families found themselves separated and isolated from one another in an unprecedented fashion. And many also came to grieve for loved ones lost, but hopefully having gone to their final reward. And all this during a time of social strife and friction in a context of extreme polarization. Absence not only makes the heart grow fonder then, but engenders a deep appreciation for the people we've often taken for granted, or who were once lights in our lives. In such trying times, we benefit from the lessons and memories forged in us through our many relationships and the mutual narratives that form our very selves. Thankfully, here and in many parts of the world, there is hope regarding the pandemic, a light at the end of the tunnel that we hope is not in vain, even as many still suffer and perish on a daily basis. Yet even so, other current events remind us in unfortunate ways of the preciousness of life and loved ones, of the ever-present divisions that threaten to push us farther apart, and thus of the fragility of the things we hold dear. These troubled times indicate the toil, the hard-won lessons and achievements of those that have gone before. It is in this spirit that we humbly conduct our own specialized work, exploring the life and legacy of St. John Henry Newman, and today, exploring members of his circle. The language of earthly light comes from a letter from Newman to Mrs. Maxwell Scott on June 3rd, 1875, not long after the death of his beloved friend, Ambrose St. Jean. Newman had been pained by the demise and departure of his friend and companion. He concluded his letter as follows, and I quote, "Do not suppose I have doubted for one instant that God has sent me this trial in pure mercy, as a means of preparing me at his own good time, whatever that may be, to follow and to regain one who was my earthly light." While the relationships treated at this symposium might not attain the depth of Newman's connection with Ambrose, the language of earthly light is most striking and apropos. It indicates the manner in which friends and companions provide illumination, especially amid darkness and through trial. These relationships impress the memory and imagination, and they continue to support and inspire us in profound and creative ways, even when we find ourselves separated by time, space, or affiliation, or even by the Great Divide itself, when the sting of grief lessens in severity and light once again dawns in our lives. With these reflections in mind, I would like to turn our attention to the keynote lecture, which will truly kick off this symposium. But one final note, I hope that you can join us for the entire symposium. At its conclusion, I will note some of the exciting things happening with NINS and briefly allude to the upcoming fall conference. And now we turn to our keynote. Dr. Peter Nockles received his Master of Arts and PhD from the University of Oxford in 1975 and 1982, respectively, studying at Worcester College and St. Cross College. He was a librarian at the John Rylands Library, University of Manchester, from 1979 until 2016. From 1990, being a curator in special collections at the John Rylands Library, Deansgate, with responsibility for the Methodist collections for many years, and librarian at Rare Books and Maps Special Collections, with responsibility for all theological book collections 2010 to 2016. He has authored, edited, and/or contributed to a number of important publications. For example, the multi-volume The History of the Desire for Christian Unity, published with Brill in 2021, the Oxford Handbook of John Henry Newman in 2018, the Oxford Handbook of the Oxford Movement, published in 2017, the Receptions of Newman volume, published in 2015 with Oxford University Press and edited by Fred Aquino and Benjamin King. Of course, many will be familiar with his masterful 1994 work, The Oxford Movement in Context, Anglican High Churchmanship, 1760 to 1857. That was with Cambridge University Press. Dr. Nockles was also the recipient of the 2021 Gallia Award for Newman Studies, which is presented by the National Institute for Newman Studies and honors the life and work of a person or institution that has contributed greatly to Newman Studies. While we had hoped to have Dr. Nockles here in person to present his lecture, unfortunately, it could not come to pass for a number of reasons. Given the difference in time zones between here and the UK, there was concern about his delivering the lecture live, and he was gracious enough to agree to pre-record it for us. And for that, we are most grateful. Following the lecture, there will be time for questions and a general discussion of the lecture. The title of Dr. Nockles' keynote is Beloved, Let Us Love One Another, for Love is of God. St. John Henry Newman, the role of friendship and personal influence in the Oxford movement. Give me just a moment, I will get the video started.
Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. St. John Henry Newman, the role of friendship and personal influence in the Oxford movement. It might be supposed that the Son of God Most High could not have loved one man more than another, or again, if so, that he would not have only one friend, but as, being all holy, he would have loved all men more or less in proportion to their holiness. Yet we find our Saviour had a private friend, and this shows us first how entirely he was a man, as much as any one of us, in his wants and feelings, and next, that there is nothing inconsistent with the fullness of Christian love in having our affections directed in one special way towards certain objects, towards those whom the circumstances of our past life or some peculiarities of character have endeared to us. These words from John Henry Newman's sermon on love of relations and friends, preached at the University Church of St Mary's, Oxford, in December 1831, with its reminder of Christ's special love for St John the Apostle, express his core belief in the centrality of friendship in the Christian life. Newman was drawing on a rich classical and ancient theological tradition. St John Chrysostom, one of Newman's particular spiritual exemplars, once wrote, "A friend is more to be longed for than the light." Aristotle had regarded friendship as an ethical virtue and crucial human activity. However, what did Newman mean by friendship? According to Newman, the popular religion of his day assumed that a general benevolence to all was superior to that bestowed on an individual. Quote, "By trying to love our relations and friends, by submitting to their wishes, though contrary to our own, by bearing with their infirmities, by overcoming their occasional waywardness and by kindness, by dwelling on their excellencies and trying to copy them, thus it is we form in our hearts that root of charity, which though small at first, may, like the mustard seed, at last even overshadow the earth." The real love of man, he argued, must depend on practice, and therefore must begin by exercising itself on our friends around us. Our relationship to God was first realized in the experience of family and friends. Newman practiced what he preached, even if there were occasions when his relationship with his own family, especially his brothers Francis and Charles and sister Harriet, were often strained. As David Newson once observed, the history of the Oxford movement was as much one of personalities and a parting of friends as of theology, ecclesiology and spirituality. There was what has been called a personalist dimension in Newman's thought, with an emphasis on affectivity as well as rationality. It privileged the ethical and the moral sense over the merely poetical or aesthetic. It was encompassed within the notion of ethos. In short, sound character was linked to sound doctrine, in accord with the Aristotelian principle of phronesis. Many felt drawn to Newman by a particular providence. In the Apologia, Newman pointed out it was, quote, "not I who sought friends, but friends who sought me," while adding that no man had kinder or more indulgent friends than I have had. Whichever way round it was, and regardless of whether such friendships met in an emotional and psychological need, which is a moot point, for Newman, friendship always had a clear purpose as part of God's plan. As he described it in his second Oxford University sermon, quoted above, the fundamental importance of the relationship between God and man was manifested in that between individual persons, core ad core. Intercessory prayer for friends was a key component of his spirituality. As Roderick Strange reminds us, Newman kept lists of those he wished to pray for. These include, quote, "those dear to me, kind to me, cold to me." Friendship was a gift, but one which, like all gifts, had to be accounted for and utilised so as to bear fruit. Newman made full use of his own friendships to exert a lasting spiritual, moral and intellectual influence on those with whom he befriended. It was a means of generating true religion and moral probity in others. Robert Christie has argued, with Newman, personal experience and friendship were handmaids of truth. He cited in illustration the words of the psalmist, "I will guide thee with mine eye." This was the difference between slaves and friends. As Newman put it, friends do not ask for literal commands, but from their knowledge of the speaker, they understand his half words, and for love of him, they anticipate his wishes. Newman became the focal centre of an admiring Oxford circle prior to the formal rise of the Oxford movement. For these friends, as one of Newman's closer later disciples, Richard William Church, later Dean Church, observed, Newman had the love which passes that of common relation. Meditating on the example of David's relationship with Jonathan, Newman had taken for his text of his poem in the Lyra Apostolica, which he wrote while quarantined in Malta in January 1833 on his epic Mediterranean journey, "Thy love for me was wonderful, passing the love of women." The intensity of emotional investment could mean that Newman sometimes felt let down by his friends, while at other times he craved solitude, and at those times even friends might be regarded as strangers. He could be hypersensitive, and there would be breaches of friendship during his life. Nevertheless, the spiritual goal of exerting moral, personal and spiritual influence through friendship was ever present. Geoffrey Faber's Oxford Apostles, published in 1933, contained an almost Freudian analysis of the close male bonds forged among the protagonists of the Oxford movement. Thus Faber sought to interpret Newman's account of a dream as he recovered from a fever in Sicily in 1833, though Newman himself later strove through the imagery of dreams to convey the reality of the hidden spiritual world. Although more nuanced in his treatment and Lytton Strachey had been, there remained an undercurrent of disdain and Faber's study for what we might today call neediness in Newman. Yet even Faber accepted the validity of the likely rejoinder to those who, from Charles Kingsley onwards, imputed an unhealthy lack of manliness in the Tractarian cult of friendship. Quote, this is Faber, "Is there anything surprising, anything that needs roundabout psychological explanations to account for the fact that men who engage in the Christian revival are held together by a love greater than that of common friendship? Faber accepted that an emotional disposition might be construed as a special gift from heaven to earnest Christians. It provided the support needed for the Oxford movement to achieve its providential purpose. Newman formed some friendships, more especially in early life, where there was not always a meeting of minds. One example was his friendship with Henry Woodgate, and later a fellow of St John's College, Oxford, cemented while they were together at Oriel College after an initial contact when they were undergraduates at Trinity College. As Newman told Woodgate's daughter following her father's death in 1874, quote, "The Oxford movement began in 1833. I had known your father since 1819 when we were both of us undergraduates. Our bond of intercourse was music. After that we were both tutors of our colleges. I say this to show how we could be very intimate, yet the subjects agitated by the tracts of the times did not come into the course of our intimacy. Our common subjects, rather, were the thought of Bishop Butler and generally the subject of moral theology." Another example was Newman's brief period of friendship with that strange individual, Joseph Blanco White, who later became first a Unitarian and finally an unbeliever. Newman first encountered him in the Oriel College common room, and he shared lodgings on Merton Lane with him. The bond of sympathy in here was a shared love of music, at a time when Newman regularly practised on the violin. It was Blanco White, a former canon of Seville Cathedral and an apostate Spanish priest, who first introduced Newman and his friends to the Roman breviary. On the other hand, Newman's other great undergraduate friendship with John William Bowden was always one of close doctrinal union. But marked differences in temperament were no barrier to Newman's friendship. It was said of Charles Marriott, who after moving to Oriel became a friend of Newman, that master and disciple were as unlike as any two men could be. The dawn of the Oxford movement is best dated not so much to John Keble's famous sermon on national apostasy, 14th of July 1833, but to Newman's sermon delivered in St Mary's, January 1832, entitled "Personal Influence, the Means of Propagating the Truth." For it was in that sermon that Newman's emphasis on the guiding principle of personality was to become the distinguishing hallmark of his vision of the movement. The church had flourished and prospered over the centuries, he argued, often in highly adverse conditions, and religious movements had arisen not so much by means of books, argument, or even miracles, or the very fact of the visible existence of the church, but primarily by means of the personal influence of teaching of individuals. An individual acting in concert with others could be the direct instrument of good, to quote any besides those who personally known to us, whoever must form a small circle. In short, the influence of truth in the world at large arose from the personal influence, direct and indirect, of those who are commissioned to teach it, so that those even in comparatively retired posts could exert the most extensive influence over the destinies of religion in the times following them. Arguably, so it was with Newman. Solitude was never a problem for Newman. In a despondent mood following his mother's death in 1836, he wrote to his sister, "God intended me to be lonely. He has so framed my mind that I am in a great measure beyond the sympathies of other people and thrown upon myself." Referring to his early years at Oriel, he informs his sister Harriet, quote, "Ever since that time I have learnt to throw myself on myself." Even this, it might be surprising that Newman valued friendships at all. He recognised the apparent contradiction. Late in life he recalled, "I've often been puzzled at myself that I should be both particularly fond of being alone and particularly fond of being with friends." Newman later described his first conversion in 1816, at the age of 15, as making him conscious and resting in the thought of two, and two only, supreme and luminously self-evident beings, myself and my Creator. There was no sense here in that comment of reliance on others, on friends or community, or its accompaniment. I only thought of the mercy to myself. For Newman's French biographer, Henri Bremont, Newman was a solitary by choice. Geoffrey Faber would have it that Newman's undoubted early detachment from the material world around him translated into this deep difference between himself and others, and became a device by which his inferiority was converted into a grand superiority. But Terence Merrigan has given a much more nuanced psychological interpretation of this first conversion and its lifelong significance, making use of the old Latin saying, "Num quam minus solus, quam cum solus," never less alone when alone. And Schoenenquilli, though, has observed the danger of Newman's resulting overriding sense of self could be a spiritual egotism, which needed correction from a stronger dose of neighbour in the communion of the church and of mankind. And eventually he found that. It has been argued that Newman's friendships tend not to be those of relations of equals, but ones of tutelage to a more senior mentor figure or to a younger man who soon became admiring disciple. The late Frank Turner suggested there was an inherent danger of emotional psychological manipulation in Newman's relationships with those in inferior position to himself. This is open to question and has been argued by myself and others elsewhere. But Newman's first friendships outside his own family circles were with undergraduates, as mentioned John William Bowden and Henry Newgate. These were closer to friendships of equality, which would last through until Bowden's early death in 1844, and Woodgate's in 1874. But there followed friendships based on what Newman himself called affectionate abandonment to intellectual mentors, among them the Fellows of Oriel College, some of them which he met after becoming a fellow himself in 1822. The intellectual as well as personal influence of Edward Hawkins on Newman was immediate, profound. Hawkins became Vicar of St Mary's in 1823, and then Newman became curate at St Clement's. During the long vacations of 1824 and 5, they were often the two to dine in hall in Oriel, spending much time in theological discussion. There was a great later falling out, but this early period is important and formative. In the Apologia, Newman recorded it was Hawkins who was the first who taught me to weigh my words, to be cautious in my statements. Robert Christie has observed the operative words here were taught me. Christie stresses the significance of Newman placing this description of the personal effect prior to his description of the intellectual influence Hawkins was to have on him, and that was substantial. Later, Newman claimed it was Hawkins who taught me to anticipate that before many years were over, there would be an attack made upon the books and canon of Scripture. And in his Apologia, he highlights the way his reading of the printed version of Hawkins's famous sermon on the use and importance of unauthoritative tradition, 1819, had a huge influence on him, he said later, in the direction of Catholicism. Hawkins also criticised the draft of one of Newman's early sermons preached at St Clement's, in which Newman, in quasi-Calvinistic fashion, had separated his congregation into sinners and saints, or sheep from goats. Hawkins's criticism would be complemented by Newman's own actual experience of parochial life. But it was the personal influence of Hawkins which made Newman more receptive to the consequences of that experience. Newman's friendship with Richard Wadley, based on the latter's pedagogical influence in Oriel, was equally formative, a great intellectual debt he owed him. Newman himself recognised this in a revealing letter in 1826. Quote, "Much as I owe to Oriel in the way of mental improvement, to none as I think do I owe so much as to you," that's Whately. "I know who it was that first gave me heart to look about me after my election as fellow, and taught me to think correctly, and strange office for an instructor, to rely upon myself. In short, Whately was the first person who opened my mind, gave it ideas and principles to cogitate upon." The intellectual bond ripened, and Newman was Whately's vice principal at St Alban Hall in Oxford, working with him to improve its academic reputation. And their close relationship was illustrated by the assistance which the young Newman provided his mentor's influential Elements of Logic, first published in 1827, which Whately fulsomely recognised in his preface, recognised the contribution of Newman, that is. Newman was also almost embarrassed by the extravagance of Whately's published notice of him, but Whately prophetically warned his disciple of the likely consequence of being a friend of his, foreseeing almost a future estrangement. As early as November 1826, he warns Newman, "I'm not sure if you're wise in your ambition to be known as a friend of mine. It is likely, as far as it has any effect, to have a dangerous effect, as I am not now reckoned a safe man, and my reputation, I warn you, is not at all likely to improve." Newman's breach with Whately first became evident in their opposed attitude to the re-election of Sir Robert Peel as MP for Oxford University in 1829. Under Whately's influence, Newman had supported Catholic emancipation and voted against the university's anti-Catholic petitions. But in 1829, he professed his indifference on the issue of emancipation, but was outspoken in the campaign to unseat Peel as MP because of Peel's volte-face turnaround in abandoning opposition and becoming a supporter of emancipation. This seemed to put Newman on the side of the old school of Tory high and dry churchmen, and as principal of St Albans Hall, Whately took mischievous pleasure in seating the fastidious Newman in the company of, quote, "a set of the least intellectual men in Oxford to dinner and most fond of port." As Newman himself later recalled, rather enjoying the irony, Whately afterwards asked me if I was proud of my new friends. The rift between the two would increase as their theological differences widened. Whately became Archbishop of Dublin in 1831, and he started to privately criticise Newman's sermons. But Newman in his turn criticised Whately's support for the Whigs government's reduction of Irish bishoprics, the real casus belli for the Oxford movement itself in 1833. Newman even avoided Whately during his visit to Oxford that year by absenting himself from the communion's Cimorelli chapel, where Whately was attending. Newman denied the story, but when Whately wrote to him asking if the rumour were true, he made matters worse by stating on account of the Archbishop's, quote, "line of ecclesiastical policy in Ireland, it's been a relief to him to see so little of your grace when you were in Oxford." In a pained response, Whately stated that he could not have found relief in avoiding the society of an old friend because of a difference on certain principles. He concluded witheringly, quote, "But though your regard for me falls so short of what mine would have been under similar circumstances, I will therefore reject what remains of it." Frederick Rogers, another former pupil and disciple of Newman, accuses him to his face of being able to cast aside friends without a fault when they fairly took part against what he considered the truth. In retrospect, Newman came to regret this action and blamed it on an over-exuberant mood of confidence that took hold of him on his recovery to good health and spirits when he returned to England after his near-death experience in Sicily in 1833. Newman himself later recalled, "Owing to this confidence, it came to pass at that time that there were a double aspect in my bearing towards others, which was necessary for me to enlarge upon. My behaviour had a mixture in it both of fierceness and of sport, and on this account I dare say it gave offence to many, nor am I here defending it." While the rift with Whately in their lifetimes never healed, he was able to make his peace with Whately's daughter Elizabeth when she came to publish the correspondence of her father after his death in the 1860s. A key factor in Newman's drift away from his former Oriel mentors was his own theological evolution from what he regarded as an incipient liberalism towards a sterner orthodoxy. Now, the influence of new friends pulled him in this very different direction, notably John Keble and Richard Howell Froude. It was Keble and Froude helped rescue Newman from what he himself regarded as the proud intellectualism to which he was in danger of succumbing under the influence of these Oriel mentors. Newman's Oriel disciple and pupil, Samuel Francis Wood, later explained that while, as in Newman's case, Whately's work and influence had sharpened and disciplined his intellect, it had done so without giving it matter to feed upon or rest upon. This lacuna was to be provided by the rising new school associated with Keble and Froude. Newman for a long time admired Froude from afar, but soon readily absorbed religious truths from his writings, which are similar to those which he had already absorbed from his reading of Bishop Butler and Butler's analogy of religion, his arguments against unbelief that God communicated himself in mysterious ways through nature. Newman made clear that from Butler, but also through the creating mind of my new master, John Keble, he now grasped the notion that the sacramental system, that is, the doctrine that material phenomena are both the types and instruments of real things unseen. The extent to which Newman looked up to Keble as friend and mentor is evident from his much later recollections. For instance, when he was nearly died in fever in Sicily in May 1833, he recalled, "I compared myself to Keble and felt that I was merely developing his, not my own convictions." He made the depth of Keble's personal influence very clear in a letter to his friend in November 1845, just a month after his conversion. This is to Keble, quote, "To you I owe it, humanly speaking, that I am what I am and where I am. Others have helped me in various ways, but no one can I but name you who has had any sort of part in setting my face in that special direction, which has led me to my present inestimable gain." Of course, whether Keble intended that Newman would become a Roman Catholic is another matter. It was thanks to Richard Howell Froude, with whom Newman had become close friends by 1828, that Newman's friendship with Keble took hold. A triumvirate now formed. For Newman, his friendship with Froude was to be even more transformative. He first got to know Froude in 1826, when the latter was elected a Fellow of Oriel, and he had an influence on him from the start. For a time, Newman had doubts about Newman, but these soon disappeared. Like his mentor Keble and Keble's other protege Isaac Williams, Froude had first associated Newman with Whately and his noetic circle. However, as Whately's influence on Newman waned, so Froude's increased. Newman was captivated by Froude's playfulness, versatility of mind, hatred of shams, personal asceticism and self-denial, devotion to the Blessed Virgin. It was only in later years that he made his own many of the doctrines, principles and practices associated with Froude, and Froude had already embraced these by the mid-1820s. That's the value of penance, mortification, celibacy, the real presence in the Eucharist, and admiration for the Church of Rome, denigration of the Reformation reformers. Newman owed to both Keble and Froude his belief in the pastoral nature of the tutorial office. Keble, unlike Newman, had never found the intellectual atmosphere of Oriel common and congenial. It was only because he regarded tutoring as a species of pastoral care that he could justify leaving a parochial queue of souls for it. It was Keble's reading parties which provided the spiritual and pastoral model for the tutorial method, which Newman, along with Froude and another friend and disciple, Robert Wilberforce, sought to apply at Oriel in the late 1820s. The key here was personal oversight based on friendship. Years later, Newman described his model of pastoral care over undergraduate pupils at Oriel. With such youths, he cultivated relations not only of intimacy but of friendship, almost of equality, putting off as much as might be the martinet manner then in fashion with college tutors, and seeking their society in outdoor exercises, on evenings and in vacations. Newman, soon joined by Froude and Robert Wilberforce, exercised the office of tutor for 6 years from 1826 and 1832, and he put these principles into practice. But a dispute over the oral tradition flared up, which pitted Newman against his erstwhile mentor, the provost by now, Edward Hawkins. There were many elements to this controversy, which is beyond the scope of what I want to say here. because both actually recognised the importance of pastoral care in a way. What concerned Hawkins, the promise, was, did friendship encourage favouritism, and also the religious direction, what he thought or foresaw as Newman's influence. According to Thomas Moseley, Newman regarded his favoured pupils as foot soldiers in future struggles, and the names of many of Newman's and Froude's pupils read like a roll call of later Tractarian followers. I won't enumerate them all here. If Newman was training his pupils for a future trial of the church, when that trial came in 1833, many of them were indeed at their posts and ready to enter the fray. Thomas Moseley, who knew his brother-in-law, because he was married to Newman's sister Harriet, later highlighted Newman's sense of destiny at this time and his future expectations for his former Oriel pupils. Quote, Newman looked out inquiringly, expectantly and believingly for the special powers and intentions of his younger friends. They generally agreed that his fault lay in believing and expecting rather too much of them. He would easily accept a promise and interpret silence itself favourably. Moseley evidently wrote from experience himself. It was the same with Mark Patterson, later rector of Lincoln College, who came under Newman's spell for a time a few years later. They were to drift apart, but even in his embittered later memoirs, Patterson recalls, it was never possible to be a quarter of an hour in his company without a warm feeling of being invited to take an onward step. Newman always tried to reach the heart and understanding of those with whom he had to do. Other enduring friendships were formed in Newman's Trinity days, that's when he was an undergraduate, notably Isaac Williams and William John Copeland, who acted as curates at St Mary's and Littlemore respectively, and became prominent Tractarians. He also formed a close friendship with John Rouse Bloxham, fellow of Magdalen and Williams' successor as his curate at Littlemore, and of course with Richard William Church, fellow of Oriel from 1838 and later Dean of St Paul's. Church, who came up to Wadham as an evangelical, had his life transformed by hearing Newman's sermon in St Mary's on the Ventures of Faith in 1836. And it was Richard William Church, who was a senior proctor, intervened famously to use his plaquette to block the motion condemning Newman's Tract 90 in the Sheldonian Theatre in February 1845. Even during his Mediterranean tour of 1832-3 with Harold Froude and Froude's father, Newman remained in contact with his Oxford friends, and while recovering from the fever which nearly killed him in Sicily in April 1333, he remained eager for news of Oriel Fellowship elections. When he saw the news of the election of Frederick Rogers on a newspaper stand in Palermo of all places, he was ecstatic, informing Rogers, I kissed the paper rapturously. Rogers, who had been one of Newman's favourite pupils, and as mentioned were to fall out, became one of his closest Oriel friends. Dean Church later recalled, there was no one who was a closer friend than Rogers, no one in whom Newman had such trust, none whose judgment he so valued, no one in whose companionship he so delighted. Froude, until his early death in February 1836, was many ways Newman's alter ego. Even from afar in Barbados, where he retired for 18 months in 1833, in vain to restore his ailing health through tuberculosis, and in a stream of letters to Newman through those years, followed the Oxford controversies and gave advice very closely. Froude even suggested that the 39 articles might be reinterpreted in a fashion compatible with Roman Catholicism, a suggestion which Newman appears to take up in his notorious Tract 90 6 years later. So what's important here is that throwaway comments in letters are being used, Newman's following out later on, and in this case after Froude's death. And Newman was prepared to overlook the inevitable outcry and alienation of the movement's old High Church supporters as a white bird plane. The outcry, of course, was his controversial publication of Froude's Remains. It was these remains, even more than his personal epistolary promptings while alive, which helped shape the trajectory of Newman's religious journey. Old High Church allies were horrified. Many others were mystified. The 19th century Scottish theologian John Tulloch found it incredible that men like Keble and Newman should have sanctioned, even taken pleasure in this publication. That's the remains. For Tulloch, many of Froude's recorded sayings were more like those of a foolish, clever boy than anything else. However, for Newman, the claims of friendship trumped everything. He regarded the record of Froude's feats of fasting, his scruples, false temptations, as having providentially come into his possession 18 months before Froude's death. For Newman, in these manuscript fragments, Froude seemed to come alive again, every word resonating with the sound of his voice. As one of Froude's biographers has noted, Newman published his remains with all its embarrassing details in order both to erect a permanent memorial to his friends, impervious to the obliteration of time, but also out of a need to forge a distinctive iconography of the movement. According to Piers Brendan, one of Froude's biographers, the remains became a means of overcoming the limitations of memory, preventing Froude's image for Newman from becoming fainter. But they presented an ideal ethos of Catholic spirituality which had been exemplified in Froude. As Sheridan Gilly has commented, by broadcasting his friend's self-torments over his flaws and failings to the world, Newman was giving orthodoxy the notoriety and excitement of revolution and heresy, thereby multiplying followers. Newman was as much the influenced as the influencer in the case of several of his disciples. Samuel Francis Wood, already mentioned, one of his Oriel pupils, is particularly important here. He came up to Oriel in 1827, made his mark as a style pupil, gained a first in classics in 1831, and his name frequently appears in Newman's diary entries. He failed to get an Oriel fellowship, so he moved to London to become a barrister, but remained close to Newman, and their correspondence in the Bodleian Library is very, very revealing and rich. In this relationship, it was once more Newman who was the recipient of religious ideas. James Barrero has convincingly argued that the germ of Newman's later theory of development was first planted in Newman's mind by Wood as early as 1836. However, friendship did not preclude strong disagreement. It was several years before Newman made his own such a theory. At the time, Newman did not accept Wood's theory that progress and development of doctrine were part of God's plan. Eventually he did. Henry Wilberforce was another of Newman's former pupils with whom he came tied by bonds of friendship and influence. He was always much closer and devoted to Newman than his elder brothers Samuel and Robert were. When Henry announced his engagement in 1834, Newman at first denied the report. It's not surprising, given that Newman told Frederick Rogers, "Henry has been staying here, and though we often talked on the subject, he said nothing about it," which I'm sure he would have done were it a fact. The reports turned out to be true. Henry Wilberforce struggled with the idea of breaking the news to Newman, sensing a pained reaction. It took their mutual friend, Frederick Rogers, another friend of Newman, to mollify him, though Rogers had to spell out the reason why Henry would not have wanted to make Newman his first confidant on this occasion. In the end, all was well, and Newman became godfather to Henry's first child. He had submitted to his friend's wishes, though contrary to his own, and in this instant finally overcame his own infirmities. Quote, "It had been the same with another disciple and Oriel pupil, George Dudley Ryder, who in 1833 had deserted the celibate state for matrimony. Newman was pained to learn of false rumours that he had cut Ryder for marrying. In fact, he had explicitly informed Ryder that he should marry, making no exception for medical marriage at this stage. In a long letter in July 1833, Newman declared, 'It is quite absurd to suppose you are not at liberty both to marry and to go into the church. And indeed I think that country parsons ought as a general rule to be married, and I am sure the generality of men ought, whether parsons or not. The celibate state is a high state to which the multitude of men cannot aspire. I do not say that those who adopt it are necessarily better than others.' Marvin O'Connell has explained Newman's attitude to his friend's marrying in terms of a temperamental weakness, frustration at the failure of people to be and to act as he wanted them to. But never Newton has probed further and suggested deeper factors at play. One explanation was Newman's belief that the perfect state of the priesthood was the glory of virginity, and that domesticity was alien to the vocation of holy orders. Newman embellished this with the claim of what he called Newman's own deep psychological aversion to unchastity, illustrated by examples of his fear of being touched or smothered, and reserving outward or physical expressions of emotions to inanimate objects like letters or mantelpieces. There was in Newman a fear over the inevitable loss of intimacy with those friends who married. In a letter to Henry Wilberforce, which he later decided not to send, but has survived, he wrote revealingly, quote, "You ask me to give my heart when you give yours to another, but I cannot, as a prudent man, so forget that is what is due to my own comfort and independence, as not to look to my own resources, making my own mind my wife, and anticipate and provide for the loss of friends, which the fashion of the age makes inevitable." Newman did not win over all those among the rising generation with whom he came into contact. James Anthony Froude came up to Oriel in 1835. As the youngest brother of Harold Froude, he was in an awkward position, carrying higher expectations of friendship and allegiance to Newman than he was able to meet. He declined the offer of his brother's rooms in Oriel and rarely attended Newman's parties in the common room. Newman himself was well aware of the distance between them. As he records in a letter to Mary Holmes in the letter of 1865, quote, "Anthony Froude was never a friend of mine, but I was civil to him as an undergraduate for his brother's sake. Of course he knew more of me as a Don than I did of him." Yet it was not that J. Froude did not seek a closer personal relationship. Like Patterson, he was enlisted as one of the authors in Newman's Lives of the English Saints. Moreover, on receiving the news of Newman's conversion, he walked out Littlemore to seek confirmation of the rumour. It was Newman who appears to have declined the interview. In his highly controversial novel, The Nemesis of Faith, 1849, J. A. Froude introduced a sympathetic representation of the character of Newman, who dissuades the plot's hero, Markham Sutherland, from committing suicide. In fact, James Anthony Froude provided one of the best accounts of Newman's appeal to the rising generation of undergraduates at Oxford. Quote, "He, Newman, always seemed to be better informed on common topics of conversation than anyone else who was present. He was never condescending with us, never didactic or authoritative, but what he said carried conviction along with it. Perhaps his supreme gift as a talker was that he never tried to be witty or to say striking things. Ironical he could be, but not ill-natured. Not a malicious anecdote was ever heard from him. Prosy he could not be. He was lightness itself, the lightness of elastic strength, and he was interesting because he never talked for talking's sake, but because he had something real to say." During the late 1830s, Newman gathered around himself a group of younger friends and disciples who pursue a scholarly life on the editions of the Library of the Fathers, living together in a house which he and Pusey had rented in St Aldaiks, Oxford, which soon got nicknamed the Monasterio. The project involved providing lodgings for young scholars without college fellowships to avoid them giving up their academic careers, and included Oriel men such as James Moseley, elder brother of Thomas, Aubrey Christie, Charles Seeger, Mark Patterson. Some of the group, along with new disciples such as J.B. Dalgate and William Lockhart, were to form the nucleus of Newman's community, which he assembled at Littlemore after 1840. Newman's desire to please and be thought highly of by Newman, Patterson's desire to be pleased and thought highly of Newman was striking. One example of this trait occurs in Patterson's diary in September 1843, after a visit to Littlemore. Quote, "Newman kinder, but not perfectly so. I am not indeed worthy to come under this roof. How uncomfortable have I made myself all this evening by a childish fancy, a weak jealousy of Newman's good opinion. But Newman feared misleading his followers, inciting them prematurely to seek paths which he was not yet ready to follow. Thus in the Apologia he claims that his utmost endeavour, quote, was to tranquillize such persons, especially those belonged to the new school, that is, who were more inclined to Rome. They were unsettled in their religious views, and as I then judged, hasty in their conclusions. He says he did not use his personal influence and friendships to pull individuals towards Rome, if anything, to put a brake on that process. One of the most painful aspects of Newman's later years as an Anglican, the time of his conversion to Rome, apart from the bereavements of Froude and Bowden, was the wider severing of friendships. One of the first was a breach with Frederick Rogers, to whom he first confides his doubts about Anglicanism as early as 1839. Thereafter, Rogers draws apart from Newman. Finally, in 1843, he informs Newman that their friendship was broken. Rogers writes, quote, "I do not like meeting you again without having said once for all what I hope you will not think hollow or false. I cannot disguise from myself how improbable, perhaps impossible, a recurrence to our former terms is." Newman was only too aware in his own case of the wrench of friendship by his crossing of the Tiber, what it would entail. Perhaps his most moving and evocative of all sermons was the one he preached in September 1843 on the anniversary of the consecration of Littlemore Church and on the eve of his own surrender of Anglican ministry, the famous The Parting of Friends. In it, the pain of an inevitable impending severance of connections with friends and parishioners was movingly expressed. Much of the sermon comprised a medley of scriptural references, but the final paragraph, an emotional peroration in which he urged his loving friends to remember when he was gone, was entirely his own. The real test of the strength of Newman's friendships was the number of those from his Anglican years with whom he eventually reconnected after he became a Catholic. Although, of course, in becoming a Roman Catholic, he was accompanied by some of his friends, such as Richard Stanton, Frederick Bowles, and others such as Ambrose St. John, who converted before him, and William Lockhart. Newman's conversion marked an inevitable breach with many friends. We've mentioned Frederick Rogers, but Isaac Williams, William Copeland, as well as Keevan and Pusey. He didn't see them for perhaps 15 to 20 years. He never spoke again to Samuel Rickards, Vicar of Stone Toft, who in the early days he was very close to. He first befriended him at Oriel. Newman felt the loss of friends the more keenly because he met very few Roman Catholics at all before being received by Dominic Barbary in 1845. In 1849, he remarks to John Bowden's widow that he had no one to talk to now, unlike in the Oriel days. Quote, "All my human affections were with those whom I have left," he told Manning in 1861. For Newman there were, quote, "no friends like old friends." Gunter Biemer has observed, the German Newman scholar, after 1845, men like Church, Rogers, Copeland and others could not be reproduced in Newman's life. It would be wrong to blame Newman for these estrangements. The Squire of Littlemore, Charles Crawley, had been close to the Tractarian Newman, specifically paid tribute to him for, quote, "showing such a kindly and forbearing spirit, such tender and loving thoughts towards those whom you left behind, and whom you seem to look upon as dear friends and brethren." Yet the existence of tensions is clear, for in this same letter in which Crawley pays a tribute, he sought to draw a contrast through what he complained as an unfriendly letter which had appeared in the Globe newspaper, supposedly under Newman's name, which was, quote, "so painfully different in tone and spirit from your late expressions to me." In his response, Newman did not deny authorship, and justifies the tone on the ground that it was the only way of forcing Protestants to get out of their minds the hope of my ever coming back. In fact, the Catholic Newman complained that most of his Anglican friends had not been kind, and in 1863 asked Isaac Williams whether he had not been dropped rather than the one doing the dropping. Newman made the point clearly in another letter to Crawley in 1862. For myself, my alienation from Anglicanism does not lessen my affection for its members, though they have put me into commentary, or my tender love for times and places now felt away. Undoubtedly some former friends had felt betrayed and abandoned by Newman's departure for Rome. In fact, the breach was not complete with some friends. There were exceptions. For some years, in the immediate aftermath of his leaving Littlemore and becoming a Catholic, unfinished practical business at Littlemore guaranteed that he continued to correspond and remain close to the former curates Bloxham, Copeland and also Squire Crawley. And some of these letters were echoes of the old friendship and a limited exchange of other news. In the case of Crawley, Newman usually sent birthday or seasonal greetings to him and his wife. In March 1847, Bloxham, by then Vice President of Magdalen, informed Newman that the venerable President, Martin Joseph Ralph, who lived to nearly 100, was asking after Newman. He never speaks of you but with respect, Bloxham added. Newman worked hard to restore as many of his broken Anglican friendships as he could. The process of restoration commenced even prior to the time which is normally dated. What I'm saying here very much following what has been said by Father Kenneth MacNab, and it's very important that how Newman, even prior to the Apologia, started to restore some of these friendships. For instance, in 1862, I think is a key year for when things changed, when he re-establishes contact with Copeland. Also responding to a friendly letter from an Anglican canon, Charles Willington Thurs, who had as an undergraduate listened to Newman preaching at St Mary's, Newman opened his heart. This is 1873, he writes to Canon Thurs, quote, "For 17 years I do not say by whose fault, if by anyone's, my own or that of others, I was simply cut off from my former friends. Many of them died in that estrangement. Some of that old generation still remain unforgiving. But since 1862 there has been a wide expression of feeling towards me on the part of those who recollect me when they were young, and on the part of some of my contemporaries. Instances of Newman recollections with Anglican friends are now abound, and one which particularly Father MacNab has traced and tracked is that with William John Copeland. And Copeland, they restored a very active correspondence. In later years, Newman often stayed at Copeland's rectory at Farnham in Essex. Newman's old friendship with Sir Frederick Rogers, now Lord Blatchford, was also fully restored, following Rogers' visit to the Birmingham Oratory in 1863. And in fact, many of the facts which Newman uses in the Apologia relied on the use of old letters to friends, which were now willingly returned to him for this very purpose. And the significance of the restoration of friendship with Copeland, as Father MacNab has said, is that Copeland went on to edit a new edition of Newman's Anglican plain and parochial sermons in the late 1860s. And the restored old closeness is evident from Copeland's comment in a letter of 1867, in which he, quote, "He offered to act as an organ blower, though now that you are going to play again." Newman subsequently renewed his former Anglican friendships with Henry Woodgate, Richard William Church, now Dean of St Paul's, George Dudley Ryder, and of course Keble and Pusey. In 1873, Newman dedicated a new edition of his Oxford University sermons to Dean Church, quote, "As one of those dear friends who in trying 5 years from 1841 to 1845, in the course of which this volume was written, did so much to comfort and uphold me." The dedication to Dean Church was one of a number of lapidary dedications of publications to Anglican friends and mentors. Another was his dedication of his discussion and arguments on several subjects, 1872, to Henry Arthur Woodgate. The accompanying letter from Newman to Woodgate illustrates the point. Quote, "Now in the last decades of our lives, it is pleasant to me to look back upon those old Oxford days in which we were together, and in memory of them to dedicate to you a volume written for the most part before the currents of opinion and course of events carried friends away in various directions and brought about great changes and bitter separations. 1873 was indeed a sad year, with the passing of so many friends of those he had known: Edward Belassis, Henry Belassis, James Robert Hope Scott, John Walker, Samuel Wilberforce. It is Newman's friendship with Ambrose St. John which was to me the closest of his life, after that of Howell Froude, and which spanned both his Anglican and Catholic life. Faber describes St. John as someone in need of a hero to worship. A former undergraduate of Christ Church, he first met Newman on a visit to Littlemore in June 1843. He turned down the offer of a curacy, and from that time until his death in 1875, was Newman's most faithful companion, crossing the Tiber with him at roughly the same time. St. John was one of those Littlemore disciples whom the acerbic Martin Patterson looked down on as intellectually inferior to Newman's earlier friends. Yet St. John was to be the key support and rock which Newman needed in all the ongoing trials of his early life. As Newman told Charles Crawley in 1861, St. John, the best and most faithful of friends to me, from the day that we left Littlemore to this, a compensation for many bereavements. St. John was the connecting link between Newman's old life and the new. As Newman put it, the dedication of the Apologia to St. John. And in you I gather up and bear in memory those familiar, affectionate companions and counsellors who in Oxford were given to me, one after another, to be my daily solace and relief. It was St. John who was earmarked by Newman as a future biographer of his choice. Newman's continual rearrangement and sorting of his papers from around 1850 onwards had their preservation as a guiding principle, quote, in order to give dear Ambrose elbow room in his knowledge of me. In the event, St. John's death in 1875 precluded this. Conclusions. As Edward Short has observed, Newman was a master, a virtuoso of friendship. He had a remarkable number and range of friends, many, but by no means all, rooted in shared religious ideals. It was not for nothing, perhaps, that Newman's most celebrated and moving sermon, given on the eve of his abandonment of the Church of England for Rome, should be entitled The Parting of Friends. Newman valued friendship not only as a medium for sharing spiritual values, but as a source of fostering true religion in others. He used his personal influence to help to inculcate a real, as distinct from merely notional, assent to religious truth. Those followers and disciples whom he befriended had their eyes opened and were spiritually changed for life by the experience. John William Bowden, Howell Froude and Ambrose St. John stand out as his closest friends, without whom life may have been harder. Newman's personal magic did not work with some of those who came into contact with. I've mentioned James Anthony Froude, but there was also Samuel Wilberforce, about much could be written. Moreover, with a few of his former Anglican friends and allies, with cordial relations were restored, even when they were restored, a certain coolness could not be overcome. For example, in a manuscript autobiography composed in 1859, Isaac Williams complained of, quote, a lack of repose and restlessness in Newman, with whom he compared unfavourably with John Keble. After Williams's death, Copeland judged that the autobiography was too little favourable to Newman to be published then. It was only in 1892 it was finally published by Williams's brother-in-law, Sir George Prevost. Personality conflicts leading to misunderstandings played a part in the cooling or loss of some friendships. The extent of the fallout with Whately was real, but was not widely replicated. Against the charge that Newman could be over-dependent on friends is sometimes possessive, it can be said that his acceptance of the workings of Providence allowed him a certain detachment when friendship was lost. Quote, blessings of friends which to my door unasked, unhoped have come. They have come, they have gone, they came to my great joy, they went to my great grief. He who gave, took away. Newman's attraction to the oratory was partly based on its family-like spirituality, which somehow paralleled his own experience of the community life, which he had experienced and enjoyed as a fellow of Oriel College, and then at Littlemore in the community which he set up there. Rooted in a sense of place and community, personality defects, and the inevitable setbacks of everyday life could be overcome in the quest for holiness. Friendship as a spiritual bond and medium of apostleship lay at the heart of this experience. Newman is the saint of friendship, cor ad quo loquitur.
Hope you can join me in thanking Dr. Nockles for the presentation and the keynote lecture that he just gave us. Wide-ranging, covering a multitude of relationships, many of which can be explored on their own. We have some time here to have a general discussion, even though Dr. Nockles is not joining us live. We do have quite a few people on the call. So if you'd like to enter some questions in the chat, you can, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question generally to the group. We also have some people here at NINS, and if you'd like to ask a question, you can approach the table and the microphone should be able to pick you up as well. I'll say, just for my own part, as someone who's, again, interested in development of doctrine, the Samuel Francis Wood relationship is one that's very intriguing to think about the influence as early as 1836, as discussed by Carrera and others. I also found it quite fascinating to think about the inner workings of Newman's mind and to think about what that repeated experience of loss might have done to him as he then transitions into life as a Roman Catholic and is attempting to also establish relationships and seemingly having difficulty. And who knows if at the end of his life, what he truly felt about the relationships he had formed as a Catholic versus those as an Anglican. But very fascinating stuff.
I think speaking specifically to the relationship that you were referencing with Samuel Wood, one of the intriguing things about that, I've explored that question in 1835, 1836 fairly closely, and the exchanges of correspondence that that Wood had with Manning before trying to engage Newman in some earnest about the subject of development, and Newman's resistance to the concept that Samuel Wood was putting forward, and Wood's sense of sadness on the one hand, but determination on the other, hopefulness that Newman would eventually see and appreciate the point that he was making, which in the end happened.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he would have that initial resistance for a number of reasons, but just thinking about some of the difficulties, the internal coherence of his Arians in the 4th century, and beating a way out of some of those difficulties and developments seem to provide that.
Right.
I would like to let everyone know as well that Peter was quite apologetic about not being able to join us, but he did want me to let everyone know that if they do have questions, to please, you can contact NINS and we'll pass those questions along to Peter via email, and hopefully he can respond directly to you.
I have a question. I would wonder if anybody there is able to answer the development of Newman's relationship with his siblings. I don't know too much about it, but I remember reading sections of a biography and said he was very close to one of his sisters, and just kind of the development. Was it a different level of friendship with or relationship with his brothers as opposed to his sisters? And if there's any information people could share, I'd be interested in that.
I know that the sister that he was closest to was Jemima. And he was quite close with both her and his mother, both named Jemima. As far as his brothers go,
it was a very fractious relationship with them both, because Frank was a very different person to Gardner Newman. He was a Marxist before Marxism existed, and Karl Marx actually quoted from Frank Newman when he was writing. He was a founder of the vegetarian movement, and he didn't approve of John Henry's life choices. And even when he was being offered the red hat, and Frank actually wrote to him and said, "Don't do this. This is a very bad idea." Charles was very, very ill for most of his life and lived in one room in a boarding house in Wales, and didn't leave his room for about 30 odd years. And most of the correspondence that existed between John Henry and Frank was they were having discussions about what we do about Charles, how do we deal with the problem of Charles. So he didn't really have a close relationship with either of them.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and he was all close with, as you said, Jemima and her son, John Rickards Mosley, who I'll talk about tomorrow a little bit. He really worried about his difficulties with faith and tried to mentor him through some of those theological and ecclesiological questions. And through his correspondence, you can see some of these relationships.
I think the sister he loved the most was the one who died very young, wasn't it, Mary?
Correct.
And when he was writing after her death, he was absolutely distraught at her loss.
We still have about 15 minutes budgeted if anybody has any questions. If not, we'll wrap up, but we do have some time.
May I ask you a question, please?
Sure.
Thank you. My name is Yukiko. I'm one of the Sister of the Society of the Sacred Heart. And thank you very much for your in-depth talk, Dr. Nichols. And I'm particularly interested in the friendship with Freud. And why did Newman insist on publishing remains, which seems to me that created enemies rather than friends? So you mentioned something about the ethos, and which is particularly interesting to me. Could you talk a little bit about it a bit more, please? And what did Newman see in Freud? Thank you.
I mean, I can just start, but I'm not going to be able to go into it as Peter might have. Obviously, it's an incredibly close relationship, part of a very exciting and formidable movement, the Oxford movement, and Freud's kind of willingness to be bold and somewhat revolutionary in his ideas and probing. At least from what I got from Peter's talk is that if you're taking Newman at face value, is that Freud's works, for better or worse, his ideas needed to be published and to get out there as a testament both to him and to what the movement could have been about as well. But I don't feel comfortable saying much more at this time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think part of what Newman found very attractive about Freud was his pushing away from the Reformation era thought of the Church of England, and a more serious embrace of the Catholic tradition writ large. And so, in some ways, the publication of the remains, shocking as they were, and really as detrimental as they were for the Oxford movement, were an effort on Newman's part to push the envelope, so to speak, to see how much further the movement could go in a Catholic direction, and in attempting what Newman saw as the correction of the Protestant error of the Church of England's past since the Reformation forward.
Very much.
I think also that Peter, in his notes that he provided to us, just it indicated, in a sense, I find it interesting for someone going through grief, in terms of their process of grieving, some sort of a manner of keeping someone alive, and what that might do spiritually as well in terms of consolation. Any other comments or questions from the audience? Well, like I said, I just want to remind you, if something comes to you later on. Oh wait, we do have one in the room.
Yeah, I'll throw out something because I just think it's interesting as a matter of our sources. Like, which of Newman's friendships do we get to know about? In some respects, we know least about something like his friendship with St. John, because you're not present in the room for it. And sometimes when you do learn about it, and this is true of a lot of the friendships, you learn aspects of it, like where it comes down to us. It's fairly common that like the letters immediately following their deaths tell us a lot that doesn't necessarily come out earlier, comes out sort of fragmentary. And then a sort of final thought about how it's the hard things for the friendships that nevertheless end up communicating something to us. Like, we learn so much about his friendships in those Anglican friendships that are broken for so long, and then we learn about them in their restoration. Or we learn about the friendships when Newman turns to letters to continue this relationship and to continue the friendship, but at a distance and mediated now by this technology. So I don't have a question unless anybody else has following thoughts, but I was just kind of thinking about that difficulty of sources and then what ends up being useful or communicates to us, but that it would have been so different. Like, again, what would be challenging or straining the friendships becomes the sources that are a window for us.
One thing that's been helpful in my own research is in his journal, a lot of times he won't say what he said to people, but he'll say, had dinner with Froude or had dinner with such and such. And so you can kind of see the frequency in which he met with certain people. It doesn't tell you the exact nature of the relationship, but it can at least give you a picture in your mind of who he's hanging out with, or who he's associating with more frequently than others, in person anyway. And every now and then he will write down, we discussed blah blah blah, even if it's not in detail. It can give us some glimpse, not as much as we would like, of course, but some idea.
I think when he goes abroad as well, because when he's certainly living at the oratory and he's not writing letters to fellow oratorians, but when he goes abroad, he starts to. So you can start to see how often he is writing his letters to these different people then. But that's only obviously in these short periods when he's not actually there. But that does give some indication, I think, of who he was most involved with.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, again, I want to encourage anyone, if questions come to mind later on or commentary that you'd like us to pass on to Peter Nockles, please do feel free to contact the staff at NINS. I want to thank you again for your presence this evening. Our first session tomorrow begins at 9 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken. And so please do join us then for several sessions tomorrow morning. And I wish you all a very good evening.